If I had to ask you, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of elves? Would you mention their good nature, their kindness and their selflessness, which goes beyond what we see in humans? Or perhaps you think of their noble look, their proud bearing, and how their features were unblemished by the passage of time. There is a certain positive outlook when it comes to this race, an almost infallible feeling. And even though it's true that many elves had these positive traits, there were some among them that had quite a twisted character and questionable morality, which could even be described as evil sometimes. In today's episode, we'll be exploring the history of Eöl the Dark Elf, and by the end of this video, you can pass judgment on his character. So Eöl was one of the Teleri elves that had given up on crossing the Great Sea to the Undying Lands, and so his people had remained in Middle-earth. We don't know if he was one of the first elves to awaken, or if he was simply a descendant of theirs, though we do know that he was related to Eöl, the king of Doriath. He would spend most of his early life living in this land, and even though this kingdom was one of the most beautiful places in Middle-earth, there was something about it that didn't sit well with Eöl, and he could never truly feel at home in this land. And so, in the year 1497 of the Years of the Trees, Eöl would finally decide to abandon his home and his people to settle in a new land elsewhere, and he was joined by some servants that were as silent and secretive as him. Together they traveled to the nearby forest of Nan Elmoth, a land which was filled with many dark trees that were the tallest in Middle-earth, and this place had a certain appeal to Eöl, and he chose to settle there. He relished the darkness that these trees created, for the sunlight could barely pierce their canopy, and Eöl decided to build his home deep in the shadows of this forest. Now, from the way he abandoned his people and chose to live in a remote area, I get the impression that he wanted to be alone for the most part, and that he didn't place much value on the company of his own people. He wasn't completely reclusive, because he actually got along extremely well with the Dwarves, and we're told that his love for this race was beyond that of any other elf of his time. The Dwarves would often pass close to his lands during their travels, and Eöl would sometimes go out to greet them and to speak with them for a while. He would share news with them about the nearby elven lands, and a strong friendship would slowly grow between them, and the Dwarves would even invite him to visit and live in their halls of Nogrod and Belacost as a guest. This was quite a rare invitation, and it reflected how much the Dwarves respected him, for throughout their history, they had invited very few elves to visit their mansions. You might wonder, why was their friendship so strong? And it might seem strange that an elf would get along so well with the Dwarves, but they actually had quite a few things in common. For Eöl was a very passionate smith, and the Dwarves taught him many of their techniques and knowledge, and through their help, Eöl's skill grew to incredible heights. One of his greatest achievements was the creation of a new type of metal that he called Galvorn, which was black in color, and it was as hard as the best dwarven steel, while also being extremely malleable and flexible, and even just a very thin layer of it could turn aside arrows and blades. Eöl would use this metal to craft a magnificent set of armor, and he would wear it throughout his travels, and he would spend hours hammering away in a great forge that he built inside of his house. And over time, Eöl developed a stoop in his posture from all of this forge work. Apart from this new metal, Eöl was also famous for crafting the twin swords called Anglekel and Angirel by using iron that he harvested from a meteorite. These blades were black in color, and they were incredibly sharp and strong, and they could even cut through other weapons of iron, though there was something very twisted about them. It seemed that they had a certain malice within them, the dark heart of Eöl, and at times they even seemed sentient, being able to speak and betray their owners. I doubt that many warriors would have been comfortable wielding these blades if they knew about their darker aspects. Now news of these weapons would reach King Thingol, and he demanded that Eöl should hand over one of these blades as a fee for living in the land of Nan Elmoth, for it was technically within the borders of Doriath. It was very painful for Eöl to give away such a masterpiece, though he didn't have much of a choice unless he chose to abandon his home, and so he reluctantly gave Anglekel to Thingol, while he kept Angorel in his possession. Now Eöl's story would soon go down a very dark path, after he witnessed a beautiful elven maiden called Aredhel passing through his forest. She was the sister of King Turgon of Gondolin, and she had gotten lost in these woods, and she was now desperately trying to find a way out. Yet her fate was sealed from the moment Eöl first laid eyes on her, for he was smitten by her beauty and he was determined to marry her, and so he cast spells to drive her deeper into the heart of these woods and to his house. Aredhel couldn't do much about this, because she could barely see where she was going. Her eyes weren't used to this darkness unlike Eol's, and she spent countless hours wandering these woods until she reached his house, exhausted from this ordeal. And Eol invited her inside, and he took her as his wife. We don't know if she had any choice in this matter, or if Eol forced her into this marriage, though in the books it is said that she wasn't wholly unwilling, and that at first she didn't hate her new life. To me, this doesn't sound very enthusiastic on her part, though it also doesn't seem like some total violation. I guess it's somewhere in between, that maybe she was open to the idea of marriage, but she wasn't really enthusiastic about it, and so she carried her doubts with her. I don't know, it's hard to say, though I'd love to hear your take on this. Now Eol was very controlling, and he commanded Aredhel to avoid the sunlight, and more importantly, that she must never make contact or seek out any of the Noldor elves. This might seem like a very specific command, though there was a reason behind it. For Eol hated the Noldor elves, because they had killed some of his people in the first kinslaying, and he felt that they had stolen many of the lands that had once belonged to the Teleri elves, and he even blamed them for Morgoth's return and all of the troubles that this brought to Middle-earth. Ironically, his wife was actually a Noldor elf, and perhaps Eol wanted her to avoid meeting her people to ensure that she would remain with him in this forest. Now in the year 220 of the First Age, Aredhel would give birth to a baby boy, and it took Eol 12 years before he gave his son a name. He would eventually call him Maeglin, and he would often bring his son along with him whenever he visited the dwarven cities, so that he could learn their crafts and their techniques. As Maeglin grew older, he began to resemble the Noldor in appearance, though his character was very similar to that of his father. Even so, he was much closer to his mother than to his father, and he loved her more. And whenever Eol was away on some journey, Aredhel would tell Maeglin stories about their ancestors and the Noldor, and they left quite an impression upon him. These memories and stories were very nostalgic for Aredhel, and she began to yearn for her people again, and she was filled with confusion. How could she have ever grown tired of the light of Gondolin, its beauty, its fountains, and its sunlight? It seemed so much better than her current life, where she often felt lonely whenever she was left alone at home, while her husband and son traveled to distant lands. Now Maeglin knew that he was destined for greater things than living in these woods, and he was desperate to visit and to speak to the Noldor, his kin. He tried to bring up these wishes with his father, though there was no chance that Eol would give him his blessing, and he was furious with his son for daring to deal with the Noldor. Eol then threatened his son, and he told him that he would imprison him if he tried to disobey his commands. Though not even such a threat was able to change Maeglin's mind at this point, and it only served to create a bigger rift between father and son. Now one night, when Eol was celebrating a feast with the Dwarves of Nogrod, Maeglin convinced his mother that this was their chance to escape, and that they should make their way to her home of Gondolin. He also planned to mislead his father to buy some time, and so he told their servants that they were visiting the sons of Feanor instead, and before he left, he stole his father's sword, Angirel. When Eol arrived home 2 days later, he fell for this deception, and he rode out in anger to Himlad, where he planned to confront Curufin and Celecorm, who were two of the sons of Feanor. When Eol arrived in their lands, he was taken to Curufin, and they would have a very cold meeting, for both of these elves disliked one another. Eol would learn some useful information, for Curufin's people had seen his family traveling to the west, and he felt humiliated at being tricked in such a simple manner. As he prepared to chase after them, Curufin insulted his heritage, and he warned him that if he kept pursuing his family, he would never return to his home in Nan Elmoth. Now Eol knew that if his wife and son were seen traveling in the west, then they must be heading for the city of Gondolin, and his only hope was to catch up with them before they passed through its secret passages. Luckily, his steed was faster than theirs, and he managed to catch sight of them around the ford of Britiak, and they all followed them in secret as they passed through the mountain paths to Gondolin. Now Eol's family would manage to pass through the gates of Gondolin, and they were taken to the king, and Turgon was overjoyed at being reunited with his sister, for he hadn't seen her for many years. Their happy meeting would be cut short by the arrival of a messenger, who told them that a dark elf was stopped by the guards of the gate, and that he claimed to be Aredhel's husband, and that he was demanding to speak to the king. This news was very troubling for Aredhel, for she was scared of Eol's wrath, though instead of turning him away, she asked Turgon to allow him to enter the city, so that he could be brought before them for judgment, and the king relented. Now as Eöl passed into the city of Gondolin, he was amazed by the beauty that surrounded him, though this only made him angrier and more hateful towards the Noldor, and so he was furious when he met King Turgon, who tried to welcome him and treat him with respect, though the king also had some very bad news for Eöl. For by the law of Gondolin, anyone that found the city could never leave it, for they couldn't risk its secret location being discovered, and so Eöl would be forced to live there. There was no chance that Eöl would give in to the whims of the Noldor, and he insisted that this land had once belonged to the Teleri, and that he wouldn't acknowledge their law, for they had no right to command him. All he wanted was his wife and son, though at this point he was fine with leaving his wife in Gondolin as long as his son returned to him. Turgon then made it very clear that he wasn't going to negotiate with Eöl, and he told him that if it wasn't for the Noldor, Eöl and his people would be slaves in Angband. He had a very simple choice ahead of him. Eöl could either choose to live here among the Noldor, or he could die within the walls of this city. A dreadful silence fell upon the hall, as Eöl stared into Turgon's eyes, without saying a word. He then suddenly grabbed a javelin that he kept hidden under his cloak, and he threw it at Maeglin. He would rather die than live among the Noldor, and he planned to take his son with him, though Aredhel would save her son's life by jumping in front of him, and the javelin pierced through her shoulder. For this horrendous act, Eöl was imprisoned, and for a while it seemed like he might actually survive this ordeal, for the javelin hadn't caused a serious wound to Aredhel, and she had managed to convince her brother to show mercy to Eöl. However, there was a very dark secret about this javelin, for its tip was poisoned, and that very evening, Aredhel would grow terribly sick, and she died from its poison. The elves had noticed it too late, and it speaks volumes about what a horrible person Eöl had become, when we consider that, while he was imprisoned, he could have told them about this poison and saved his wife, but instead he preferred to watch her die. When Eöl was finally brought before Turgon, it was clear that he would find no mercy, and they dragged him to Caragdor, which was a steep cliff upon the north side of Gondolin, and they threw him down from its walls. As Maeglin watched in silence at his father's final moments, Eöl cried out, "So you forsake your father and his kin, ill-gotten son. Here shall you fail of all your hopes, and here may you yet die, the same death as I," which was a malicious prophecy that would one day come true, though that is a story for another time. How do you guys feel about Eöl? Was he one of the worst elves to ever live, and do you have any sympathy for him? I feel that the moment he allowed his wife to die from the poison, he lost all sympathy from me, for that was such a horrible and malicious act that he was beyond redemption. As always, I'd like to thank my patrons. You guys really helped make this channel possible, and I deeply appreciate your support, especially my Wizard-Tier patrons, Jacob Williams, Michelangelo, T. Gorman, James Tudgel, Mike Feeney, and Roland Mervold. If you too would like to help and support this channel while unlocking some cool perks, I'll be leaving a link to my Patreon page in the video description. I'll also be leaving links to our Facebook page, Instagram, Discord, and Twitter communities, so follow us if you'd like to have some extra Lord of the Rings lore in your day-to-day lives. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, it really helps the channel, and subscribe to join our fellowship today. I hope to see you all in my next video, where together we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-earth.